Francis Levy, co-director of the Philoctetes Center. Welcome to The Motive for Metaphor. And the title of tonight's roundtable comes from a Wallace Stevens poem. I would gladly take blame for naming it such, but I'm guiltless in that regard. We had a discussion about it last night, a rather interesting discussion. And
We're all guiltless.
Yeah, I think the person most responsible, the initials would be P and F. Now, the art you see on the walls here is, the title of this exhibit is Self-Reflection, The True Mirror. It was curated by Cohen, the head of the art department at Marymount Manhattan College. All of our programs are available if you go to our site, philoctetes.org, www.philoctetes.org. You can see all past Philoctetes roundtables. This particular roundtable, as all roundtables, is simulcast, so that if you go to our site, you can actually see the roundtable right now if you're at home. I'm now pleased to introduce Paul Fry. Paul Fry is William Lamson Professor of English at Yale University. He's the author of A Defense of Poetry, Essays on the Occasion of Writing, and editor of The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. His new book, Wordsworth and the Poetry of What We Are, will appear in May 2008. Dr. Fry will moderate tonight to this afternoon's panel and introduce the other panelists.
Thank you very much, Francis. I started life writing a book called The Poet's Calling in the English Ode, which made me quite by accident and gratuitously an authority on poetry. So here I am. It's indeed a great pleasure to be here. I want to introduce the panelists, as Francis suggested. Ted Cohen is professor of philosophy at the University of Chicago, past president of the American Society for Aesthetics, and a past president of the Central Division of the American Philosophical Association. He has always had an interest in the relationship between metaphors and jokes, which may or may come out today. An interest which has obvious ramifications for those of us with a Freudian background. Whether that comes out today, of course, will also remain to be seen. I first got to know his work when, many years ago, when reading a very good anthology of essays on metaphor edited by Shelley Sachs, and Ted Cohen's essay leads off that anthology, and that is, as I say, how I first got to know him. Frederick Turner is professor of the arts and humanities at the University of Texas at Dallas. He's written 27 books translated in 12 languages. He's an extraordinary polymath who is a poet, who is deeply versed in neurophysiology and a great many literary and scientific endeavors in between. I first got to know Frederick Turner's work when reading an anthology of essays called Beauty and the Brain, which was a neurophysiological approach to aesthetics. And in this anthology, he has an absolutely fascinating thesis about why poetry is made of lines, that is to say, why we have such a thing as the poetic line, which is just the kind of question that fascinates me, just because it's sort of so obvious that we never think about it. And, well, his idea is that it's the maximum unit of simultaneity the brain can process without any sense of pastness or temporal unfolding. And then Susan Stewart, it's a great pleasure to meet her again and to introduce a person whose work I first came to know when reading her extraordinary book on longing, which has to do with collecting, with miniaturization and giganticism, and a fascinating thesis. Susan has written many other important works of criticism and is also a brilliant poet. Her book Columbarium won the National Book Critics Circle Award in 2003, and she has a new book, Red Rover, forthcoming. Rosanna Warren who teaches, well, I've been forgetting to tell where at least some of these people teach. Susan teaches at Princeton. Rosanna Warren teaches at Boston University. She, too, is both a poet and a critic. Her forthcoming book of criticism is Fables of the Self, Studies in Lyric poetry. She is also, however, a distinguished poet with 3 collections of poems, and also a translator, has worked widely in translation, and with Stephen Scully has translated Euripides' Suppliant Women. Now, I suppose before opening the conversation, it may behoove me, maybe it doesn't, but it may behoove me to say a word or two in general on the subject of metaphor, if only to throw out topics that we might, to which we might recur. Recur is, of course, a magic word, and whenever the subject of metaphor arises. So I'll just say that those of us who were trained in literary studies probably first learned about the difference between the tenor and the vehicle, and we probably also realize that to this day we can't figure out which is which because because the vocabulary is so confusing. If Juliet is the sun, right? And this is, of course, the famous instance of metaphor with which Donald Davidson begins. If Juliet is the sun, as far as I can grasp, the tenor in that metaphor is the sun. The vehicle in that metaphor is Juliet. That is to say, Juliet is the basis. Juliet is that to which an egregious comparison is introduced, and that's the tenor. This anticipates in many ways the distinction between, the famous distinction between focus and frame in Max Black's work on metaphor, and that kind of supplies a bridge between those trained in literary studies and those trained in philosophy. My colleague at Cornell, Jonathan Culler, I think has a very interesting and important way of describing metaphor as a combination of 2 synecdoches, which is to say, you have an entity, which is, of course, as an entity, a whole. Part of that entity reminds you of part of another entity. And the link of the parts in question gives you a comparison with another whole. But the bridge is made by way of 2 synecdoches. Obviously, this creates all kinds of incongruities. Everyone agrees that metaphor, the poetic spark of metaphor, depends partly on the way in which it doesn't work, the way in which it's constantly threatening to become catachresis, so that, for example, without really thinking in so many words about metaphor, the great literary philosopher Kenneth Burke could write a book called Perspective by Incongruity, which is in effect what many of us feel we gain or derive from metaphor. And by the same token, the philosopher Nelson Goodman tells us that metaphor yields while resisting, that in the experience of metaphor we have a simultaneous tension between the way in which it doesn't work and almost inspiring this opposite feeling, the way in which it does. Among all of these positions which accommodate or favor metaphor, there is the fascinating position of Donald Davidson, which goes, in a certain way, in 2 extremes at once. Donald Davidson says, if Juliet is the sun, that can only mean that Juliet is the sun, that there must be, in any expression, this form of literal meaning. If you open it up to the form of approximation that we expect from metaphor, on the contrary, says Davidson, you open yourself to a more or less unlimited and interminable process of movement through a network of associations that is ultimately uncontrollable. The result being that in taking up a position which we associate with the extreme forms of logical positivism, Davidson at the same time acknowledges the insistence of deconstruction, post-structuralism, that language just is metaphoricity, that there's no escaping it, and that what we take to be undecidable in any construal of meaning is, in some sense, at bottom, metaphorical. Finally, and then I'll shut up. Deconstruction, of course, arises, as you know, in a tradition of linguistics that, at least for part of its history, was called structuralism. And what's interesting about this tradition is that it takes the idea of metaphor, which is, of course, one trope among a great many in classical rhetoric, and in a way reduces the whole phenomenon of rhetoric to two tropes: metaphor on the one hand, metonymy on the other. And this is something that we might return to later, because some of the more interesting exegeses of metaphor that we read today, for example, Lacan's interpretation of a wonderful line of Victor Hugo, his sheaf was neither miserly nor spiteful, and I would love to come back to that line at some point, is analyzable in terms of a conflict or contrast between metaphor and metonymy. All right, so there's a variety of possible topics, and I would love now to throw the conversation open to the others. And who would like to begin?
Oh, I don't mind starting.
Ted?
I will just tell you what I've been doing. I got interested in metaphor a number of years ago, and philosophers talked about metaphor for as long ago as Aristotle, but in my view, it's only my view, you don't find anything very interesting in reading about metaphor in Nietzsche, or more interesting is to read Hobbes and Locke, who don't like it. But with the advent of real philosophy of language and serious linguistics, which is entirely a 20th century phenomenon, there came about no more than about 30, 35 years ago to be an interest in metaphor, and I became interested in it. I have no interest in one question. Well, I'm interested in it, but I'm incompetent to discuss it. What Davidson argued is that there is no such thing as metaphorical meaning. That's what he said.
Yep.
You can think whatever you like about Juliet as the sun, but what it means is what it means, and given that, it's false. My view, when I used to teach with Paul Ricoeur, I used to say this straight out, say nobody is entitled to have an opinion about this question if he doesn't have a theory of meaning. And there are theories of meaning out there. They're serious. They're among the major achievements of 20th century philosophy of language and linguistics. They're almost, incidentally, exclusively an Anglo-American phenomenon. And it's hard to learn that stuff. I know a little bit, but it's not my field. So I talk about metaphor, I hope, in ways that have nothing to do with whether what you really think Romeo is communicating when he says, "Hark, what light through yonder window breaks, Juliet's the sun." Whether you think that's a meaning or something else, I don't really care. And I have been pretty careful not ever to talk about metaphorical meaning without also writing a sentence saying, I shouldn't be taken really to mean this because this may be an indefensible view. I've been working on two things lately. One is this, maybe a kind of a wild idea, but in order to understand a metaphor, what you have to be able to do is you have to be able to think of one thing as something that it plainly isn't. Except in very curious cases of metaphors which remain true if you take them literally, like no man is an island. But that led me to think that there's a special case of thinking of one thing as something which it isn't, and that's the case in which you think of one person as somebody else. And the special case of that is the case in which you think of yourself as somebody else. So I've been defending the view that in order to engage competently in moral conversation or to read narrative fiction, you have to be able to do this. And I'm claiming that the talent for doing it, which is greater in some people than in others, has to be the same talent as the talent for understanding a metaphor. And I wound up along the way realizing that this was a rather extravagant use of the term metaphor, so I have now appended a little defense in which I claim, I don't think we want to get into this, but I lay this card on the table, that in terms of what you might very loosely call the logic of it, that metaphor, simile, parables, and allegories all work the same way. And those things that books of rhetoric distinguished for us years ago, metonymy, meiosis, synecdoche, oxymoron, it's not They're not uninteresting, but their logic is basically the same. So I've been doing that, and I've written a book now called Thinking of Others. I think, you know, you have to be able to imagine yourself to be Roger Thornhill if you're going to appreciate Hitchcock's masterpiece, North by Northwest. And I think the ability to do that is the same, because you're not, really. The other thing I've become interested in is whatever else happens when a metaphor gets made, rules are broken. Now, linguistics hasn't told us what all these rules are, but plainly what you're doing is putting words together in a way in which the grammar of the language says they can't go. And I think that when that happens, all hell breaks loose, that you lose control of it. And it becomes difficult then. I give one example. The book of the Bible that I'm not quite sure what your Bible calls it. It's sometimes called Canticles. Sometimes it's called the Song of Solomon. Usually it's called the Song of Songs. In Hebrew, it's the Shir HaShirim. When you read that book, you read one after another metaphor or simile, all of which say things like, he is a deer and he has come into my garden, and so on. And they are all read as either metaphors or similes or some sort of figure for sex. Now, the church can't abide that. Neither can standard Judaism. So when, for whatever reason, Ezra decided he was going to put that into the Bible, it had to be domesticated. It always happens when something gets canonized. And so what has happened is that the church rereads all of those metaphors that seem to be metaphors for human sex as standing for the love of Jesus for the church. Jews read it as if it was, well,
Sure.
how good is your Catholic theology? Probably better than mine, but I have a little. And Jews read it as if it stood for the love of God for Israel. But what's happened is that once you've made this thing and tossed it out there, hoping it will be read in a certain way, the rules that make literal language work so that when somebody doesn't get it, you can say he didn't understand, aren't there. And it's unclear really what then to say. It is probably the case that grasping a metaphor has a whole lot to do with appreciating a work of art and very little to do with understanding ordinary language. We understand reasonably well how we understand ordinary language. What we don't know is what goes on in this other case. And being a hopeless romantic, I hope it remains the case that we don't know what's going on there. I don't want to see that taken in. That's pretty much what I've been up to, trying to toe this thin line. One other thing I might mention, the best book about this is by Joseph Stern, a very difficult but very good book by somebody who really is good in the philosophy of language, called Metaphor and Context. If you rip right out of context a line like Juliet is the sun, which had already become a pretty well-worn example by the time Donald Davidson got to it, even if you have the other parts, hark, what light through yonder window breaks, it is the east, and Juliet is the sun. So what is Romeo up to? If you have no context whatever, you might guess that he's claiming that it's very unpleasant to be around her. It's like breaking out in a rash. Well, you could read it that way. What controls reading it the other way? And you say something like this, and I'm about to stop it. The old view, which is simply wrong, is that a metaphor is a compressed simile, and that what it really means is Romeo or Juliet is like the sun. If it's a compressed simile, the simile is itself figurative. And the old idea that you could capture the literal sense by reducing it to these is simply wrong. But you ask yourself, in what respect is she like the sun? And now what you're doing is looking for properties that she and the sun share. You can find some. They both have mass. They both have weight. They both either reflect or emit light. And none of those is relevant. What's relevant is that she makes the world bright, she makes Romeo feel warmer, but all of those are metaphors. Now, she's not warm the way the sun is warm. what's happening here is that somehow what we call, but we always use this word when we don't really know what to say, the context is controlling which of these possible similarities is relevant. And you can really go wrong. The one figure of speech that we probably understand pretty well, because although in its own way it's as complex as metaphor, you didn't mention, is irony. In irony, like metaphor, if you don't understand the literal meanings of the words, you are powerless to understand the figure. This is not true, for instance, with idioms. You can learn that he went west in Ireland means that he died, or that he kicked the bucket, or that he bit the dust, or he gave up the ghost. Those are all idiomatic. You could learn that those are ways of saying that he died without paying any attention to the literal meaning, without even knowing why it is that he bought the farm, means that he died. I can tell you, it comes from the First World War and insurance for soldiers. But with idiom, it's like that. But with a metaphor, if you depart from the meanings of the words literally, you are powerless to figure out what they amount to, as in irony. If a student, enraged at the waste of his life it was to take a class of mine, says to the student who recommended me as a teacher, "Oh, thanks a lot, Cohen is a wonderful teacher," speaking ironically, he gets across his opinion that I'm an abysmal teacher. There is no semantics conceivable in which the sentence, "Cohen is a wonderful teacher," means Cohen is an abysmal teacher. None. Something strange has happened here, but that's how irony works. But with metaphor, it's right there in the words. And when it comes out, if it does, Wallace Stevens is a hard case. There are a lot of Stevens metaphors that I think we have a lot of trouble figuring out what he wanted us to get out of them.
Both the poems that have metaphor in the title seem not to offer a theory of metaphor at all.
No.
Yeah.
Well, Stevens is the kind of poet who doesn't want a lot of theorizing about poetry anyway. I mean, it's... that's all. I thought I would just tell you what I've been doing.
Rosanna.
Well, I would pick up from there by saying that I came mulling over this topic. I came to the cards that I would lay on the table would be the proposition that metaphor is absolutely not simile, and in interesting ways. Metaphor seems to me to be about identity, and simile about analysis. And metaphor seems to me to be, in a sense, about the creative imagination, which I take in a Coleridgean sense, and I brought a little bit of Coleridge to read out loud to put it in the air here, and simile to be more like what Coleridge would be calling in the realm of fancy, which is playing with counters and doing an analytical or associative operation. And moving, I brought also, since I like empirical studies and case law and precedent, I brought two of my gods, Wallace Stevens and Rimbaud, to propose that they could teach us a great deal about these topics. The Stevens poem that interests me most from this point of view is not the motive for metaphor, but it's An Ordinary Evening in New Haven. And there's an arc in that very long and complex poem that one could follow from the very first lines. It starts, "The eye's plain version is a thing apart, the vulgate of experience." Starting there from a kind of dead ground of literalism, but is already metaphorical by being called the vulgate of experience, and then going through marvelous permutations, which Stevens predicts for us by saying, of this a few words, and yet, and yet, and yet, which is, I take, what we'll be doing today, and yet, and yet, and yet, to come to his conclusion that it is not in the premise that reality is a solid. It may be a shade that traverses a dust, a force that traverses a shade. I find this useful in thinking about metaphor because, for me, metaphor is a way of thinking about reality and about the endless desire of poetic language for reality, to make a reality, to be a reality. And yet that notion of reality proposed, I think, in literature is this mobile, dynamic sort, that, in the sense that a shade that traverses a dust, a force that traverses a shade. I brought in Rimbaud because his very short writing life, short and more intense than most people's long lives, compresses another arc. That is, the young Rimbaud, the 15-year-old, is writing poems in the mode that he inherited and learned so well from his masters, of essentially discursive and explanatory poetry. And between 1870 and 1874, from the Drunken Boat to the Illumination, you have him systematically suppressing discursive links, explanation, explicit logic, and composing more and more radical poetry that I still think is radical poetry, requiring the reader to become a participant in the action of meaning-making, synaptic explosions, image to image, all kinds of realms of figuration, metaphor being a large part of it. And I suppose I want to conclude these preliminary remarks of mine by focusing on that word action, because I think that in literature, and specifically it's thinking about metaphor, we're not talking about, as Stephen says, solids. We're talking about forms of action. We're talking about modes of action, action in the imagination. Or what Rimbaud has said in one of his great letters, the Lettres du Voyant, the letters of the seer. He explained what he was up to, and that was that he said the ancient Greeks, ils rythment l'action. They made a rhythm of action, and that was Rimbaud's vision of what he wanted to do. And so I like to think of metaphor dynamically, I suppose.
Susan?
Well, we're kind of the poetry gang, I think, on the side of the room. I will say that my interests in metaphor also are both philosophical on the one hand and poetic on the other, but I'm also interested in the way there's a kind of clash between these approaches. And one question we might ask is whether poetic metaphors give us a more capacious form of knowledge than say, literal approaches to knowledge. Davidson's argument that surely metaphors are lies because we wouldn't be able to say they were figurative language otherwise, I think is well taken. And yet I also wonder about questions like why we need error in culture. What is the role of error in culture? Why we don't have enough art? Why do we need to make more art constantly? I've been very influenced in my own intellectual development by the thought of Vico and Vico's model of a kind of a progress that goes from terror and the invention of metaphors by necessity on to various kinds of identifications and misidentifications until, in fact, metaphorical language becomes literal and invisible and dead, and the idea of a dead metaphor. Owen Barfield's writings on metaphor are very close to this as well. So that the question for me becomes the one of what is literal language. It seems to me literal language is a special case in the use of language. I can't even say that without using a metaphor to express it. The other thing is this idea of control, which came up in both Paul's remarks and Ted's. I think art gives us a special sphere where we can make errors and where control is not necessary. A lot of our description of a metaphor that goes out of control is very similar to what Kant says about aesthetical symbols and those particular situations in poetic composition when you are giving the rules to art rather than working from the rules to art. And I've been thinking about this for the last few weeks in anticipation of coming today, and I have to say yesterday I was going for a walk in the conservation lands behind my house in New Jersey, where I often walk in the morning. And I was thinking about Nelson Goodman's idea that we apply labels, metaphorical labels, to phenomena. And I was, in fact, to tell the truth, I guess I'm always telling the truth right now, I hope. that I was looking for signs of spring, looking for something to which I could apply a Nelson Goodman-like label. And indeed, when you look for signs of spring, you find them. And I was particularly looking for small birds and for the first signs of the trees budding out. But then I went to another part of the fields, and there I saw the most amazing thing, because it was quite a still morning, and there was a little small whirlwind close to the ground, where just the wind had a kind of confluence, and I really didn't know what it was. I couldn't understand it, and my mind just filled with one metaphor after another to describe what it might be. I mean, it was you would say, if it had a bit more terror to it, it was an experience of sublimity, where I couldn't apply any concepts of my understanding. But my sense also was coming away that all theories of metaphor are true, that it's impossible and probably unnecessary to reconcile them, and that they might be context-specific, the way uses of language are context-specific.
You'll excuse me, Frederick. After that, I have to read from the second stanza of The Motive for Metaphor. In the same way, you were happy in spring with the half colors of quarter things, the slightly brighter sky, the melting clouds, the single bird, the obscure moon. And then he gets going. The obscure moon lighting an obscure world of things that would never quite be expressed, where you yourself were never quite yourself, and did not want nor have to be, desiring the exhilarations of changes. I mean, the rest of it perhaps for later.
Wonderful. I first came across, I suppose, at least, I first came across metaphor really in the form of a ritual symbol. I was raised in Central Africa by my parents, Victor and Edith Turner, they were doing anthropology, and I was hanging around with a bunch of Ndembu boys, and we were one of the big things that happens in an African society is ritual, and so we would watch the rituals very carefully, and we would especially interested in, for instance, the girls' puberty ritual. And we were bad little boys, of course. And one of the great ritual symbols of the Ndembu was the muji tree. Now, the muji tree is a tree with a white sap, and it's either planted or cut off, and it's either planted in a village or cut off and stuck in the ground for certain ceremonies concerning particularly women. The white sap of the muji tree is explained by the Ndembu as being both milk, mother's milk, and also as being semen, but it's semen in the sense that that property and inheritance goes through the mother. That there's this. You inherit your maternal uncle's property. You don't inherit your father's property. Which is interesting because it ensures that nobody's ever going to inherit property so illegitimately, if you see what I mean. But it also means the qualities of purity and innocence and goodness. If you're a good person, you've got a white liver. It's counterposed against the color red, which is very much blood of hunters, but also menstrual blood, but it's more a symbol of violence and energy and strength, and black, which is a symbol of corruption and death, but it's also a mystical symbol, a symbol of kind of mystical, that which is mystically beyond. Well, I sort of understood that in a very simple, boyish way. I already sort of knew that I was a poet at that time, but that was my basic notion of what a symbol was, and I don't believe that there's any difference really between symbols and metaphors and so on. They're all things which I think go beyond the bounds of language, and this is the point. The word that the Ndembu had for a symbol, for a profound ritual symbol, was a chinjikijilu. Now, a chinjikijilu is a blaze that is cut on a tree. In other words, the literal meaning of the word Chinjikijilu, if you're using it, you've been out hunting, you come back, you say, I got into territory I didn't know, so I knew that I was getting into territory that I didn't know, so I cut a Chinjikijilu on a tree, and then I got further and I cut another Chinjikijilu, and then I cut another one so that I could find my way back. All right? I thought about that at the time. I thought it was that, in other words, it was a way to connect known territory with unknown territory, a way to find your way back. I did once get lost in the savannah in Africa, and as a child, and I was very frightened, and it would have been I did find my way back, but it was almost by coincidence. It's very important to have a landmark, to have a Chinjikijilu. Well, many years later, I came across the work of Ludwig Wittgenstein, and I came across the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, and I came across two sayings which at the time absolutely infuriated me. One was, the limits of my language are the limits of my world, and the other was, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must remain silent. And that seemed to me to sort of essentially say, at first blush, say that there was no such thing as poetry. At least not poetry as I thought of it as being. That poetry was transcending the limits of one's world, and that poetry was, it was speaking about that which one cannot speak. Later on, I realized that in fact both statements are paradoxes, because of course in speaking of that whereof one cannot speak, which is what Wittgenstein is doing, he is in fact speaking of that which he's not remaining silent about it. And in talking about the limits of my world, the word limit itself implies that there's something on the other side of it, which means that it's not a limit anymore. That occurred to me a little bit later on, but I then remembered the symbol of the Chinjikijilu, and I sort of made a little diagram of it, and the diagram of it is, well, I've just drawn a circle here with the track of a hunter or an explorer going off into whatever is outside the circle. And what one would put inside that circle would be, I suppose, my language and my world, everything that can be rationally connected with everything else, the past, the knowable, all forms of communication that are phatic communion, that are simply the kinds of keeping the bandwidth open, keeping the channel open, as when we say good morning, or when we say, how about the Yankees or something. All the forms of language in which no real new knowledge, nothing new is being communicated. That's what's inside that circle. And I say it's also the past. What's outside the circle is not world, is not past, is future, I suppose you could say, it is not language, it's nonsense. Nonsense in the classic sort of Wittgensteinian sense. So my hunter or explorer is going out into a place that is nonsense. Well, what does he do? He cuts a blaze. Now, where does it make sense to cut a blaze? If you cut it inside the circle, that tells you how to get from one place where you know where you are to another place where you know where you are. It's completely useless. If you cut it outside the circle, it just tells you how to get from one place where you're lost to another place where you're lost. It's totally useless. There's only one place where it makes any sense to cut the blaze at all, and that is on the exact edge between the known and the unknown. And if you cut it there, then it immediately opens up a new space. That is, everything that is within eyeshot of the blaze, it now becomes a very peculiar piece of territory because it's unknown. But at the same time, you can find your way back from there. It's connected, but it's also, it's uncanny. It's a little piece of the unknown, it's a little piece of the known. It's sort of, it's got this neutral space. It's this, it's there to be explored. It has a reality, but it doesn't have a reality. Very interesting idea. And then, of course, I came that connected up with the great words of William Shakespeare in Midsummer Night's Dream, spoken, interestingly enough, by Theseus, who is a skeptic about this whole kind of use of language. And Theseus says, if I remember, he says, the lunatic, the lover, and the poet are of imagination all compact. One sees more devils than vast hell can hold. That is the madman. The lover, all as frantic, sees Helen's beauty in a brow of Egypt. The poet's eye, in a fine frenzy rolling, doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven, and as imagination bodies forth the forms of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. So, he always said it best, didn't he, old Shakespeare? Well, it seemed to me then that in a sense Shakespeare and the Ndembu had exactly the same idea, that it was bodying forth the forms of things unknown and giving to local airy nothing a local habitation and a name. And so I've always taken metaphor then as being one of the ways in which we essentially extend the language, that we make new language. And if we take that seriously, I mean, I just loved it when Rosanna said it's making new meanings, it's an action, it's making, I would say, making a new piece of the world. If Wittgenstein is right, the limits of my language are the limits of my world. If you extend the language, then you extend the world. In fact, if you add a new piece to the past, which is what you're doing, you've actually helped to create the next moment. And the next moment really probably needs to be created. Before we came along, I suppose it was speciation that was making the next kind of moment, and it was the evolution of new ecosystems that was making the next thing. We shouldn't take the existence of the future for granted. We're all at work making it, and we make it, I think, through Chinjiki-jilus of one kind or another. If you give me a minute or two more, I wanted to make a further remark about how about I suppose essentially the relationship between metaphor in this sense as extending language and meaning, and how can I put it? One of the things that's been striking me, I did a sort of game theory analysis of the first few books of the Bible, and especially the stories in Genesis, in the book of Genesis. And out of that, I began to see that essentially the earliest games that are played in it, the earliest life and death games that are played in it, become the basis for later life and death games in it. It begins with something like a zero-sum game, but very quickly you get into non-zero-sum games, and you get into very complicated kinds of trades, complicated kind of trading. We human beings are reciprocating animals. We reciprocate to live. How do you reciprocate with God? Well, you reciprocate with God through sacrifice. Basically, sacrifice is the way that you trade with God. And if you look at the story of the Garden of Eden, what you have there is the recognition, the fundamental recognition that we owe our lives to God. And in theory, if we disobeyed God, then God would have a perfect right to take that life back again. Well, the next thing that happens is, well, we make a sacrifice to God. And, we insist that our sacrifice is better than our brother's sacrifice. And if God doesn't think so, then we kill our brother. And then a little bit later, we have a father who is called upon to kill his firstborn son. But he is allowed instead to sacrifice a ram. That's the story of Abraham and Isaac, of course. And so I started thinking, well, in fact, maybe the whole history that is being told here is a history of what you might call the commutation of sacrifice. That earlier greater sacrifices, I got some of this from René Girard, earlier greater sacrifices are paid for at a discount by later, more abstract kinds of sacrifices. So you have the firstborn son is replaced by a ram, animal sacrifices replaced by sacrifices of candles and things, you doves or something. And then you get to sacrifices of money, and then you get to sacrifices of your time, and sacrifices sacrifices of your self-interest, and so on. Now, in a sense, this process of commutation of sacrifice seemed to me to be a rather good candidate in the history, evolution of language, for the evolution of meaning. Because if you can trade one thing for another, it means that you've established a kind of an equivalence between them. And the direction of the trading, the direction of the sacrificial commutation process has always been towards greater and greater abstraction. That we sort of gradually invented abstraction by trading slightly less concrete things for slightly more concrete things, all the way back. And this seemed to me to be another way of describing that way that the way in which we expand language through metaphor. And I'm sorry I've gone on so long.
Well, I wanted to ask, apropos both parts of your comment, but also what others have been saying as well. I wanted to ask whether we can agree that the success or spark of a metaphor correlates in some way to the daring with which something unknown or not yet known is explored by it, or whether there is a form of successful metaphor which stays within your circle. I've recently taken a special interest, because of needing to work it up for a conference, in the poetry of Yehuda Amichai, who is an extraordinary manipulator of what might be called commonplace or even bathetic metaphor. That is to say, stunning, startling, unsettling comparisons of important things with trivial things, vulgar things, everyday things, but both terms of the comparison very much within our ordinary world. And I wondered whether the idea of metaphor as a constructive flirtation with the unknown needs somehow also to entail a sense of the importance of this kind of metaphor, the metaphor of bathos or of the everyday.
The evening is laid out on the sky like a patient etherized on a table.
Yes.
I have a couple of, I'd straighten out a couple of historical facts that may or may not be of interest. You know, Amichai says, quote, "Metaphor is the greatest invention in the history of the human race, on a par with the wheel," quote. But he makes that kind of metaphor. When Wittgenstein was at Cambridge, I finally located this remark, and so I now can give you a citation, but I haven't got it with me. Probably the most talented philosopher at Cambridge at the time was a man named F.P. Ramsey. Died before he was 30. And after he read the line, both on Monnick's, right, "Whereof we cannot speak, thereof we must be silent," Ramsey said, "And we probably can't whistle it either." There's a cuteness in Wittgenstein that Wittgenstein's a very great philosopher, but he's sort of a pain too, you know. A kind of a curious thing is that the paper that he mentioned earlier, the Max Black paper called Metaphor, was written in the 1950s and published in the Proceedings of the Aristotelian Society in England, and I don't think anybody paid any attention to it. They began to pay attention to it when Nelson Goodman's Languages of Art came out in the late 1960s, because Goodman, famous for not thinking that anyone besides himself had anything worth saying, said some nice things about black, although by the time they were at conferences together, it was clear that Goodman thought black was just completely wrong. Goodman makes an observation that I think is, I don't know if he had this in mind, but until he said it, it never occurred to me. And you remind me that if you want to know about someone, perhaps yourself, whether you understand a metaphor, the usual way of going about that is to ask the person whose comprehension of the metaphor is in question to explain it, or to produce a paraphrase, as that's come to be called. It's kind of a strange use of the word paraphrase, but it's become the standard word. But there's another thing you can do. And I learned this when I'm now, for the second time in my life, I don't think I'm ever going to do this again. Well, it's working better this time than it did 20 years ago. I'm teaching a course called Metaphors and Jokes. I learned something the first time I taught this course that surprised me, so it doesn't surprise me anymore. Everybody can make up metaphors, if you give them enough help. Not everybody can make up a joke, even if you give them a lot of help. I would not have expected things to turn out that way. The metaphors they make up are often rather lame, but not always. But they always can do it if you help them a little bit. I would have thought everybody could make up a joke, but it turns out simply not true. One way in which a person shows you, or you can show yourself, or your friends, that you understand a metaphor is to go on with it. If Miles Davis is the Picasso of jazz, then who's the Rembrandt of jazz? And who's the Louis Armstrong of jazz? And you'll discover right away that people who know jazz, they not only will give you answers, but they'll fight about them, about what's the right answer. That's why there is this very strange little thing hanging. Donald Davidson knew more philosophy of language than any of the people he's contending with. And he has a theory of meaning, and he has a theory of language. And when he says there's no such thing as metaphorical meaning, it's very difficult to resist this. But what even Davidson has to admit is that we think of these metaphors as being apt or inapt. And we argue about them. Somebody might not think that Miles was the Picasso of jazz. He'd be wrong, but he might not think so. And when we wonder then who is the Rembrandt, is that Louis? Well, I don't know. There's a game you can try. It amazes me when you try this game. When I was taught this game, the guy who taught it to me called it the game of analogies, but I think you might as well call it the game of metaphor. If you play this game, when it's your turn, you have to think of somebody but not tell us whom you're thinking of. And now to play fair, it has to be somebody you suppose that we would all recognize. We then try to guess who you're thinking of by asking you questions, and all our questions are like this. If you were a piece of furniture, what would you be? Yeah. If you were a metal, what would you be? If you were a drink, what would you be? What is astounding about this game is not only that people will guess, and they'll do it pretty quickly, but they will then sometimes argue. I remember a guy, when we were playing this game, whose character was Ho Chi Minh, of now, faint memory. And when somebody asked, what would you be if you were a metal, the guy answered, iron. And when we had finally guessed that it was Ho Chi Minh, we all said, that's not right. Ho Chi Minh, not iron. It has to be something flexible, maybe tempered steel, maybe something else, but not rigid. And it's amazing what the real associations are with these things. So that even if Davidson is right, and you can't consider that an aspect of meaning, there still is something right about taking the metaphor in one way and not in another way. When Winston Churchill in Missouri in, 1942, 1943, speaking before the Missouri state government, called Mussolini a utensil, was a brilliant figure. I mean, there are a lot of things you could have said about Mussolini that would have been insulting. You could have called him the devil, you could have called him an asshole, you could have called him... But in calling him a utensil, Churchill got across the idea that he was now simply something being wielded by Hitler. He no longer was making up any in his own. But then, if Mussolini is a utensil, then what was Hitler? And what was Eisenhower? And what was Churchill? The power of the metaphors to open up these things. What Goodman pointed out is that when you take the word, as he was saying earlier, from its home realm to what he calls its alien realm, Goodman's book is rife with metaphors, you move this word from here over here and apply it to something it never applied to before. But what Goodman noted is that the word back in its home is associated with other words, and they get brought along too. And you try to fit them in. And the success of the metaphor depends up to a point on the degree to which you can do that. I'm about to sort of give you one example of an unqualified case in which the use of a metaphor increased knowledge. At the end of the 19th century and into the early part of the 20th century, it occurred to a couple of people, only a couple, to take the words that normally apply to fluids and liquids and apply them to light. When people first talked about waves of light, this was nothing but a metaphor. But it turned out to have a suggestive power so great that the modern theory of light comes out of it. I mean, if there are waves, then there must be amplitude, and there must be wavelength, and there must be apogee. All of that turns out to work, but it's all metaphorical in the beginning. It's not metaphorical now. I do not think calling something a light wave is a metaphor any longer. I mentioned one other thing, then I will stop. A good thing to ask yourself about, I have no fixed opinion, is there is no doubt in my mind, it used to be my mind, that even if you cannot use these words when talking about music, if you don't hear music in terms of velocity and altitude, music means nothing to you. You have to hear a pitch like ah as being higher than ah, and you have to hear something like dum 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 as being faster than na 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 na. Yeah. But now all these words are words that have their literal application to the movement of physical objects in space. I don't know whether those are metaphors when they're used about music. My guess is that maybe not, but maybe so. I just don't know. The normal test for me for whether a word is being used metaphorically is whether understanding this use requires knowing the literal meaning. If you don't know what it meant to say that Macbeth doth murder Duncan, you would be powerless to understand Macbeth doth murder Sleep. It's plainly a metaphor. But on the other hand, in the cases of genuine ambiguity, in order to know that Sherlock Holmes wears a cape and what that means, you don't have to know anything at all about geographical promontories. Word cape is one of about, what, 600-700 at most words in English that actually have more than one meaning. One. And you can learn them independently of one another. You can know one of the meanings and be ignorant of the other. But in the case of a metaphor, you cannot be ignorant of the literal meaning, or the metaphorical meaning simply won't come through. That's all.
Earlier you were saying that irony and metaphor differ in that irony requires an extraverbal context to be understood, and metaphor is in the language. You're suggesting something a little bit closer to irony in metaphor itself now, are you not? Because the context as you say, we need a certain amount of base knowledge before we can.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The thing that I'll expand just a little on this, because if you've never read this stuff, a good place to look is in the work of a guy actually revolutionized some thought about this, a philosopher of language named Paul Grice. He introduced, in a way that neither linguists nor philosophers of language had done before, at least if they had, I don't know it, a difference between what a sentence means and what the speaker means by his sentence. Yeah. In a certain kind of central case, these are the same. I say it's warm in here, meaning by that it's warm in here, in order to get you to believe that I am warm in here, and furthermore that I wish that you believed, and so on and so on.
I don't know where the thermostat is.
But when the student says, Cohen is a wonderful teacher, his sentence can't mean Cohen is an abysmal teacher, but he can mean that by his sentence. And once we have that distinction, I think we see that we don't have to say the same thing in the case of metaphor. I think Macbeth doth murder sleep means whatever it means, if meaning is the right way to talk about it, and we don't have to recur to what the speaker means. We don't have to, we can, speaking loosely, talk about what Romeo means when he calls Juliet the sun. But what he means is in the sentence. Juliet is the sun.
Shall we go back to the Poets' Corner? Very much alive, of course.
I was just thinking about the kinds of distinctions that each of you are making. That I think of that Amakai line in the poem about going to school on the first day. And I only know the English version, not the Hebrew, but he said, and my hands which clung to the banister are still clinging. And so you have an extension of one moment in time into the future in that way. Or Thomas Transtomer's line, with his work as with a glove, a man feels the universe. Now those kinds of lines, I think, stay with you and in the way an aphorism does. And they actually have applicable uses and situations. But when you have a poetic metaphor like Wallace Stevens saying the rabbit, thinking of a rabbit as the king of ghosts, it seems to me that that's a metaphor that stays new. It just cannot be absorbed back into the progress of life. And perhaps it's because, like other metaphors of his or expressions, she sang beyond the genius of the sea, you have a mixture of a human perspective on nature, an abstraction, something that's socially created or something that's super sensible, all in a kind of catachresis brought together.
Let me ask you one question about that line.
Yeah.
There's a line.
Which one? Sorry, which line?
This line of Amikai's.
Oh, yes.
He says, is there a stone in this land that has not been thrown? Does that feel like a figure of speech to you? I mean, the literal answer to the literal question has to be, of course. There are a lot of stones in Jerusalem and East Jerusalem have never been thrown. He's getting at he's getting at something else here, right?
Partly because it's a question. I mean, if he said, I mean, you could imagine an aphorism, there's not a stone here that has not been thrown.
Okay.
And then you could apply it, but because it's a question. And I think the role of questions in poetry in that regard is very interesting. Often the question itself doesn't contain metaphorical language, but it almost is a metaphor for a metaphor.
I wonder whether we're, I mean,
Metalepsis.
whether we're making a distinction between metaphorical language and any other kind of language. I mean, if you look at the etymology of any word, I mean, with the possible exception of a few pieces of syntagmata, and I'm not even sure that with that, what you'll find is that the words are metaphors, or they're made of bunches of metaphors. And that if you then sort of look at the, look them up in the good old American Heritage Dictionary of Indo-European, you'll find, every word is a member of an immensely branching species tree of metaphors. I mean, it's almost as if the language itself is thinking, and it's using people's uses of it as its synapses. So, I mean, in a sense, every word is a metaphor. I think the distinction between dead and live metaphors is a good one. There are dead metaphors. Shakespeare said, "All my art is dressing old words new," and I think that what he was doing was he was waking up resurrecting dead metaphors. But it's all metaphors.
Well, now, could we pause over that? Because this is something, I mean, I mentioned it in passing to begin with. It's a view held by many, particularly those influenced by this linguistic tradition that's partly associated with structuralism. Yeah, and I think of Jakobson, that any message I can communicate has 6 possible sets or orientations. It's expressive on the one hand, it's a command on the other, it's referential, it's phatic, as you were describing earlier, it's metalingual, that is to say there's something definitional about a subject-predicate relation, but it's also poetic, that is to say there's an element of its orientation to itself. And this is what Jakobson calls the poetic function, and he insists that it, I can't think of another word, but he doesn't mean this, infects any utterance or expression, which is to say, there is residual metaphoric material in anything we can possibly say. Now, this is plainly not a view taken by anyone who has a theory of meaning.
Not by me.
Yeah.
I think it's plainly false.
Yeah. And I wonder, well, I wonder what Ted thinks about it, but I also wonder if this seems a worthwhile thinking about the properties of any utterance, where, incidentally, one of these 6 orientations is understood as the dominant, that is to say, as that which intentionally governs a particular utterance. I wonder if anybody else would comment on that, whether they find it useful or not useful.
One way of thinking about poetry is that it's a very, it seems to me, in some sense, primitive art, an art of conjuring, and it's done not only through associating images with other images, making figures, but it's also done rhythmically and sonorously, and so bodying forth a reality of sense and feeling that comes to have its own weight. I think this is partly what Jakobson is trying to describe by the poetic, that it's somehow self-referring and self-being, or as Stevens would say, the poem is the race itself and not about it. This presence, this conjuring presence of poetry, and in a specific case through metaphor, seems to be important to remember in a time when we have such demystifying theories in our intellectual life, and where the very notion of presence is suspect and potentially even criminal. So I go to Rimbaud as I go to Homer and Sappho and Catullus to restore my sense, not of a magic trick, but of a mystery, and to restore the honor of mystery as opposed to mystification, and to restore the honor of creation as opposed to mere analysis. I think that powerful cognitive operations of analysis are going on in the acts of imaginative creation, but they're not the only thing that's going on. I particularly welcome this invitation to come to talk about metaphor, to make this plea for restoring a more ancient sense of the art of poetry as an art of conjuring presence through rhythm and through image making and through the figurative uses of image making, and in a I hope not a sentimental way, but in a way that I take to be a profound realism, that to say Juliet is the sun is a way of opening, yes, us to the unknown, which then becomes part of our knowledge. And so I would want to say that poetry is a profoundly cognitive operation, and that's important to keep stressing over and over, since it not only Hobbes and Locke, but many, I think, thinkers in our time keep trying to discipline poetry and making it merely decorative or merely, in some sense, emotional, and sideline it that way. I think it deserves full cognitive restoration and honor, and I mean, I take it that's part of the burden of the exploration of our conversation today.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I also observed that it's partly a matter of, I think, sensibility or temperament. You've recently been a number of books that have caught my attention, sort of. I don't care much for them, but they're interesting. Dawkins, Hitchens, these all read like the kind of attacks on religion written by people when they're about 13 or 14. Mm-hmm. And the clearest sense you get from a book like Hitchens is that he has no glimmer of what it would be like to be a religious person. He thinks that they're just people who are bought into some superstition. Yeah. In the case of Dawkins, who's really a high-class scientist, I think, yes, that could happen. That kind of work, that kind of analysis might actually remove your sense of mystery. But it didn't say for Einstein. it deepened his sense of mystery. The more he understood, the more the whole thing seemed miraculous. It's one of the things that puzzles me about why anybody should think that if you happen to believe in the theory of evolution, it meant that you were an opponent of religion.
Right.
I mean, what an amazing way in which God did it. That's incredible. Nobody but God could have thought up that. All that natural selection, all that business. What I'm urging is not to get. You imagine an argument that Max Black might be involved in, and it would go like this. Black would say, a metaphor has cognitive content. And he gives us examples. And his opponent says, okay, what is that content? And he won't be satisfied until Black gives the content in a literal sentence. And then the guy will say, okay, but that shows the metaphor was unnecessary. Very hard to play this game because that word tends to belong to the opposition. Why not? This is a kind of thing that Plato says, poetry is no good because it has nothing much to do with the truth. Aristotle likes poetry, and so he says, yes, poetry is at least sometimes okay because it does have something to do with it. Well, what if poetry were okay even if it didn't have anything to do with the truth? Why accept Plato's claim that that's the only measure? Why suppose that it's only if poetry is cognitive, whatever on earth that means, that we shouldn't be reading and teaching poetry to our kids and urging them to try writing it and applauding them when they do it, even if it's lame.
But why would it matter? It has to matter. It has to matter because it has something to do with what we conceive as enlarging our conceptions of the real.
That's okay, but why call that cognitive? It gives you a richer life.
I would say, well, I think it has to do with knowledge, of expanding notions of knowledge, and that seems to have partly to do with the notions of cognitive. But the word that I'm really attached to, and I think it has a wonderful set of actions and explorations in Stevens, say, is the real. And poetry's and Stevens' entire oeuvre is, I think, about a play between what he called the imagination and sometimes he called it the real, sometimes fact. But it is that the reason it can't be translated to some logical positivist literal statement is because it's not a matter of semantics only or of syntax only. It's a matter of enactment, which is about vowels and consonants and rhythm and performance. And that makes a truth.
It's okay, I'm not here to defend them. But people refer to the positivists who have never read Hans Hahn or Otto Neurath or Rudolf Carnap. The positivists loved poetry. They were steeped particularly in German language poetry. If you had Hans Hahn here, he would quote Hölderlin until hell froze over. Or I dropped dead. I don't like Hölderlin. But anyway, they didn't dislike poetry. The idea that they had a cudgel that they were wielding against everything except the literal is simply wrong. All they wanted to do was to get rid of metaphysics. And they wanted to get rid of metaphysics' claim to be describing the world in a testable way. And they said, you can't test it. It's different. But they didn't say, even Frege says, we must, as human beings, have certain ideas in common because if that weren't true, poetry would be impossible. I mean, those guys, the positivists become everybody's sort of whipping boy, although that's changing. The whipping boy now is about to be the deconstructionists. They love the stuff. So I don't...
They may love it, but I don't like to have it put in quarantine.
Well,
I don't think it should be in quarantine.
But you don't want it taught in the physics department either.
What goes on in the brain when we talk about meaning and when we talk about truth, it's a piece of fantastic magic. I mean, what is going on? I mean, with a memory, memory seems to be, from a neurophysiological point of view, at first it was thought to be a set of connection. Well, at first it was thought to be actually embodied in individual neurons, that there was a grandmother neuron, or at least some people suggested that there was. Then it was thought to be embodied that, you know, there was a particular neuron that would fire when you saw your grandmother, you know, and that was the grandmother neuron, you know. If you lost it, then you'd forget your grandmother.
I certainly had one. Went off every time she came around.
Right, but then it was thought to be a pattern of a pattern of connections between neurons. Then it was thought to be, well, it's not a pattern of connections because they are continually being recalibrated. All the synaptic connections are being recalibrated all the time. Every time a synapse fires, it changes the shape of the synapse, and it changes it in such a way that it's not going to be quite the same the second time around. Then it was thought to be the actual incredibly complicated cycle of firings in which neurons were firing each other off and suppressing each other and so on. Then it was thought to be, in fact, the strange attractor of such a set of firings of neurons. So it's immensely dynamic. And this is what constitutes a memory of something. This is what constitutes the GNO in cognitive and cognition. That's the GNO. I mean, it's or the KNO to go back to another side of Indo-European. So it's you know. I'm not saying there's no such thing as truth. I really do believe in truth, and I believe in science. I think it's terrific. But it's done in this very, very strange way. If we try to sort of say that here we have all this strange stuff going on in here, and then outside there's the whole world, and this somehow represents or is a picture of what is out there, that's not going to work. What's in here is part of what's out there, and always was. And in fact, the basic thing is what is true. I mean, we can be pragmatists about this. What is true is when what is in here effectively relates with what is out there as another part of the universe. And so it's action. What?
You mentioned in your earlier talk, does the golden vowel play a role in some of this, kind of helpful in sort of talking about the creation of these meanings out of reality?
Oh, certainly. I mean, if you look at any kind of deep, I mean, Campbell too, any kind of deep study of how meanings grow, it gives you this very strange sense of how dynamic it all is. How much a matter of action it is.
That's right, yeah.
And so it's only if we think of the world as basically inanimate and dead that we have a problem in sort of having this live thing represented. But what a lot of the physicists are now saying is that it's sort of alive all the way down in a sense, that you can really analyze the whole of physics in terms of information theory, that it's a continuous sort of self-computing set of computations. Eddington wasn't. He said, the world is much more like a gigantic thought than like a gigantic machine. What's beginning to disappear, I think, is the idea of the idea of how can I put it, reality being anything other than subjective. And I don't mean that in the sense that we're imagining it all. Everything in the world is imagining everything else, and the resultant of that, the most parsimonious interpretation of that, is the good laws of science.
I think we're...
Sorry, I've gone on too long.
No, I think we're verging, though, on the time when we might have questions from the audience, but I did want to ask Susan if you had some concluding remarks before we go to the audience.
Then it's fallen to me to decide whether poetry is a more capacious form of knowledge than other forms. But I would remind myself and others that poetry is not made just of words. And so a linguistic philosophy can't account for all of the aspects of poetry. And I was so intrigued by what Ted was saying about connotation, because, of course, a rhythm also has connotation, as do melodies and other parts of structure that come into poetic form. And I guess I'll just stop there because I know people had their hands up and we put them.
I would like to add just one thing to that. You probably can help. I have, not a lot, and I'm not going to burden you with them, but I have lines of poetry in my mind that sort of haunt me, and I have no idea what they mean. And so you're obviously right about one thing, at least. They have captured me quite apart from anything that I can make out of the language. I mean, I really just don't know what these lines from Yeats or Holderlin or Rilke mean. But they stick with me almost as if they were something like music. But I know what the words mean. I don't know what the lines mean. And,
that's a good way of putting it.
And the
We
rhythm.
don't think them, we think with them.
No,
Yeah.
they are sort of comforting in a way. Although somebody may explain to me that they mean something I would hate, but it's just strange.
Sir.
It was a fascinating panel, and I'm completely wired up and full of thoughts.
Could you identify yourself just so people know what you're...
I'm Svilotan. I'm a psychoanalyst, and I'm going to mention Freud in connection with metaphor.
Good.
But before I do this, for comic relief, I'd like to tell a metaphor and a joke. And it's a cartoon from the New Yorker, which shows a beef-necked, red-faced CEO type and an innocent young thing. And the caption reads, "Suck, Mary Beth, suck. Blow is a figure of speech." So I hope I didn't shock anybody.
That's not your daddy's New Yorker.
Which New Yorker do you read?
But I think it makes the point between what was discussed here quite a while now, the concrete and the metaphorical meaning of language. And in this connection, I'd like to mention what metaphor means in Greece, concretely. Metaphora in Athens means taxi. You take a metaphora to get from one place to another.
That's what.
And that's what metaphor does. It is a bridge between perception and imagination.
Not in Greek. The word metaphor, in our sense, is first used in Greek by Aristotle.
Yeah, but in this
He doesn't mean a taxi.
No, but I didn't say that. But he means transferring, moving, action, a concrete meaning into the imaginative realm.
No, he means taking a word, which he says, that appropriately applies either to the genus or the species, and applying it instead to the species or the genus.
Yeah, but
It has nothing to do with the imagination in Aristotle.
But for me it does. And
Oh,
I
for
think,
you, fine. I just don't want the Greeks brought into this.
But I think the point is to move
Yeah, but it's
the
going
discussion.
to mean a taxi.
Yeah.
So obviously some Greeks were using it metaphorically. In fact, if you see catharsis on the side of a van in
Yeah.
Athens, it means dry cleaning.
Right. And another literal meaning, polemos, is the ministry of war. And we're having polemics, but we're not really doing any war here. So the point is to understand this idea of something which is carried, as you said, from one realm into another. From the realm of perception to imagination, i.e. to the dream. And I'm challenging the panel as a whole to address the issue of dream as the master metaphor.
You might notice that in the piece he referred to earlier by Donald Davidson, Davidson says, quote, "Metaphor is the dream work of language."
Yeah, but dream has not been mentioned in this gathering today until this minute. The word dream has not come up.
Midsummer Night's Dream.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, what is the relevance of Freud to it? In 1894, he talks about the meaning of symptoms as metaphorical. And he uses the word transposition, translocation, and translation. Now, translation has the same meaning of carrying. You carry something from one place to another. So this is the realm of the dream and of the image, is visualizing something which we first see with our eyes and then only see with our mind's eye, so to speak. The last thing I want to make as a point is that metaphor not only makes the visible word visible in mind, but also makes spiritual ideas visible as physical metaphors.
Beautiful.
All right.
Say who you are.
Okay, I'm Fred Turner's partner in literary crime. I'm Frederick Firestein. Rosanna knows who I am, I think. And I want to make a couple of comments, because I'm not a professor. I'm a psychoanalyst as well as a poet. Publish 8 books of poems, and Fred and I always talk about beauty is truth, truth, beauty, so I'm going to tell the truth a little bit. The most powerful metaphor for me, and I want to talk about subjectivity and affect as well as cognition. The most powerful metaphor for me in Amachai's work, and it's in Stephen Mitchell's translation, when his father died, and this was when my father died, and I read the poem over and over again, he said, "I have lost half of my father's weight." And that, I think, is Amachai's best metaphor. When, in my new book of poems, I hate to self-advertise here, but when I wanted to write about affect and where I was most powerfully affected in a poem called What Happened to Your Immortal City, it's a lyric sequence on 9/11. The poem was about me sitting in the garden reading a book called Rumor Verified that you well know. And that's where Robert Penn Warren told, I think, his greatest truths. Now let me just make a couple of comments as a psychoanalyst, which I am. And at the same institute, one of the institutes, VZAT, but I'm not a Freudian. I use a multimodal approach. So,
You lost the mic.
You lost the mic.
all right, I'll talk loud.
Don't come back.
I think there's a button to press there, I'm pretty sure. Yeah.
Firing a gun. I know, exactly. Did you get us some thunder? Yes. Yeah.
You know, when I was a kid, my mother always told me to keep quiet on the bus, so... Don't touch it, thank you. All right, now I'm going to talk as a psychoanalyst, okay? All right, we're in the place of Lawrence QB, for instance, and Susan Derry, who is a great Hungarian psychoanalyst who I've recommended to Fred many times. And in terms of metaphor, from a psychoanalyst point of view, and I taught symbolization and creativity for 20 years, both QB, who was here at the New York Psychoanalytic, and Derry, who followed his work but only gave him a footnote, talked about the bridging function of metaphor. The metaphor is a bridge that both closes the distance and opens the distance. So it's both. And, you know, I would recommend both their works. I'm very pedantic here, and I'm using the topographical model. Not QB's ego psychology stuff, but his neurosis, his study of the neurosis and the poetry. I forget the title of the book, but read it. It's a short book. It's great. It's the best on this topic, and that's what I have to say. Okay.
Okay, here.
Hello, my name is David Hecht. I'm a student in cognitive science, and I have a particular interest. One of my particular interests is in the relationship between art and science and the notions of consilience and the way that human knowledge transcends these kind of prescribed boundaries. And as such, I was really glad to hear at the end of what you all were saying, the references to some of the more esoteric realms that science has been going into in terms of connecting ideas that were not once thought to be tangible or expressible in terms of formal mathematical models, information theory, these kind of things. But it also started with Professor Cohen's mentioning of the early distinction that was eliminated between the metaphor of light as a wave and the actual expression of light as a wave. And throughout, I've been thinking in terms of something I was exposed to a few years ago, the notions of embodiment that cognitive science has been promoting for a while, and as came up a few times, the notion of poetry and metaphor as bodying forth expression is really fascinating to me because I'd never heard that expression before, but it makes so much sense to me, and especially in the context of talk about transposition and communication between perception and idea. And I think Lakoff and Johnson are the two of the prominent names in Metaphors We Live By is the big work, in talking about the relationship in these expressions and language to actual processes in the body that are transposed through action into a way of expressing that action. And again, I'm reminded when we talk about seeing in a work, being the subject or the character. I mean, it's almost, Juliet is the sun. Well, how does the sun affect you when you are in front of it? And there's a physical component to that. I think that I'm wondering if you all, in mentioning this, if you think that there's any significant relationship between what the body gives to metaphor and what metaphor then allows cognition to do. And the one extension of this that I heard, and I think Ramachandran presented it, but I don't know that he came up with it because I don't know when he says things what he's coming up with or quoting. But he talked about metaphor as an actual process in the brain that allows communication between the perceptual modalities. And so he tried to devise the rules of art through this, but whether or not that's even worthy of discussion is something else. But he tried to say, and I've heard it in other places, that metaphor is a process by which something like language and action are translated through to each other. And so I wondered if you have any...
You might look at one thing that there's work by, I'm incompetent to judge this, but, and it's unimportant for me. Howard Gardner and his people have done studies, and some of the studies on children I kind of disapprove of. I think you ought to leave children alone. But they have discovered, at least they're confident in announcing this, that in many cases, if you have a person with a brain injury that has left his linguistic ability absolutely intact, but has damaged his visual capacity, that he can't understand metaphors. And the idea that there is a visual component in this seems to me awfully strong. I mean, we simply say, for instance, that we're being invited to see Juliet as the sun. And although you might think that that's a figure of speech, using these vision words, maybe not. I mean, maybe there really is something quite vivid involved in this. The other part of Gardner's research has to do with the utter absence of metaphor among children until they reach a certain age. That part I like,
that's
because...
Actually, that development point is interesting because of the development of theory of mind and of the ability to assume intersubjective stances. And that was what I was thinking with this notion of assuming the role of the character, is the ability to place yourself in another's shoes is almost it's a metaphorical act as well. But yet it's a physiologically demonstrated process, at least to a certain degree, with mirror neurons and these tasks like the false belief tasks. So I think there's something really interesting there, especially in children.
In the study of the laying down or fixing of memory. I mean, if we had to remember everything that we experience, we would have to carry our brains around in a truck. We have to. One of the most important functions of memory is to forget, and apparently we do this work of editing memory, at least partly while sleeping, during rapid eye movement sleep. And what seems to be going on is that this happens in the hippocampus. What happens is that there's all the experiences of the day are kind of wildly combined in all kinds of ways with past experience, and then they're edited. The ones which are memorable, which actually seem to make a kind of connection that works, are kept. And so what you've got there is something which would then begin to work in very nicely to psychoanalysis, and would at the same time we would see I mean, dreaming is clearly Everybody has this gigantic metaphor-making ability when they're asleep. In fact, when we're awake, most of the time, I think we're actually suppressing it.
Yes.
Well, Freud never used the term metaphor in all of his description of dreams.
Yeah.
He never used the term metaphor. It's not in the interpretation of dreams.
Metaphor is? Ed?
The only place Freud mentions that I know of in terms of metaphor is in jokes.
Yeah.
What would you say the difference
Which is actually
between...
kind of a weird title for that book, too. A word is Witz. I'm not sure he's really talking about jokes. I hope not, because the jokes in that book are so bad, it's almost unbelievable.
I don't know, some of them are not.
Like the one about Krakow. What would you say the difference between, if Freud tends to avoid the word metaphor, as you say he does, he's happy enough to use the word symbol. Why do you think he prefers the word symbol?
I think there is an old distinction made about that, which is from a case presentation sometime in the, I think it's in the 30s or 40s, a paper was published where a patient is talking about is in a session talking, and at some point the words lab boy come to his mind. And the analyst at the session was focused a lot on the patient's dirty mind and dirty thoughts, and dirty both in terms of anal dirty and sexual dirty and so on. So the understanding of dirty, of lab boy, which the analyst thought referred to him, was that the analyst is the lab boy involved in cleaning up what he's saying. And that was considered a metaphor. Whereas simultaneously, one of the things that the lab boy does in cleaning is that takes a brush and cleans the test tube. And that referred to sexuality and sexual intercourse, and that was symbolic. Yes. That was a symbol. So that was kind of distinction.
If you want to, you have to come up if you want. I can speak. No, you can't because we are broadcasting.
But don't break your neck.
Yeah, don't break your neck. Just take any of the microphones.
My name is Linda Firestein, and I'm a psychoanalyst at NPAP. And although Freud doesn't speak explicitly of metaphor, when you look at the difference between manifest and latent content, I think that it's there, because there is, I think, metaphorical aspects that you go from manifest to latent content.
I think the opposite.
You do.
When you go from the manifest to the latent, you are going from more abstract to more concrete.
But you do get uses of metaphor, I think, when you look at the dream work.
I think we sometimes do it in our work, but I think if you actually look at Freud's idea about interpretation of dreams, it's the other way around. You go from the abstract, which is in the manifest, because it involves a lot of elaboration, secondary elaboration, to what is really essentially much more impulsive and primary process, which is more concrete.
But couldn't we simply say that the relationship between metaphor and symbol is like the relationship between dogs and wolves? I mean, a metaphor is a tamed symbol, and that these symbols are these sort of glowing, dreadful things that we've got inside us, and we tame them and we put them to use as metaphors.
I don't want to defend my wife, but I will. Look, from my point of view, I teach the advanced course in dreams, as V knows, as well as symbolization. And manifest content, the whole issue in the 50s with QB and everyone here was to really pay close attention to manifest content. And there are ways you could get to interpreting dreams by simply taking a key metaphor and one or two associations to it, and you don't even need the latent content to really get to the heart of it, because the affect is in the metaphor and the dream. But I don't want to be pedantic about it. But let me just say,
at some point we can argue that.
Okay, we'll argue it, but I want to add one thing. You were talking about Freud, and I must recommend someone who worked here named Jacob Arlo, and he was the best in his understanding of metaphor. And when Fred talked about dreams, look, Arlo had this one key image in one of his papers, in his collected papers, and we're dreaming all the time. We just see it at night when our eyes are closed, like the lights go out in a movie theater and the screen goes up. Or as Delmo Schwartz said, in dreams begin reality. So the manifest content...
No, begin responsibility.
No, I'm saying reality. It's a joke.
Well,
That's a joke. It's a pun.
Don't stick Delmore Schwartz with a title like that. Schwartz knew what he was doing.
Young lady.
Thank you for calling me young, anyway.
It was Blake that said, "In dreams begin reality," or something like it.
My name is Rebecca Packer, and sometimes I write and I teach. I train people to teach English and humanities. I had something to share and something to ask you. It seems to me that so often the operations of the mind and our experience of our own brain is so mysterious. It seems to me, someone once referred to it in a poem as sort of the dark cathedral. The skull is a dark cathedral. And it seemed to me that metaphor is often a way in which we go into that dark place and bring some evidence back that something was going on in the mind, and it's one of the few ways we have of making it manifest and maybe communicating it to the world. And really my question is somewhat simple. I wanted to know what you valued most about metaphor. I just wanted to know why you cared about it or what you thought it had to offer.
Cool. Is that to you?
Oh, well, it's true that you were looking at me, weren't you? Yes. I'd like to seize the occasion of your question by going back to what I threatened to talk about at the beginning, because I do feel that we need to honor the psychoanalytic context, if not sort of exclusive focus of this group. And so I want to quote again the line, an English translation of the French. His sheaf was neither miserly nor spiteful. Now, again, against the background of the Poussin, you'll remember that both in the print, which is in the one Poussin show, and also in the original, which is in the other, there are sheafs. And a sheaf is kind of like this. And, of course...
What is it?
Well, it's a sheaf, you know. I mean, I refer you to last night's discussion. A sheaf, right?
It's a bunch of stalks.
It's a bunch of stalks, but they're tied together, and they're really quite solid and unified. So, in any case, now Boaz is, as it were, banished from the line by the fact that it's the sheaf that's neither miserly nor spiteful. But he's nevertheless hovering around the line, because obviously a sheaf is not sort of very interested in being either miserly or spiteful. And we know both from the Hugo and from the Poussin painting that Boaz is a very patriarchal guy, looking down at Ruth there, who's supplicating, and you know, in fact it's odd if you look at the painting that in fact he's really about to ask her to stay and not to go anyplace else, because he really looks rather fierce, and the Hugo sort of suggests this, because the sheaf is his. You know, it's a question of possession of the sheaf. And once it's a question of possession of the sheaf, then of course, well, possibly miserliness and spitefulness are involved after all, and Boaz returns to the line. But I would suggest, and this is the movement between metaphor and symbol, that whereas he's displaced from the line by a metaphoric action, that is to say, the sheaf takes his place, he returns to the line, and this is why I emphasize the sheaf, as a symbol, and as the kind of symbol that Freud would recognize. I don't exactly want to say that that's what I value most about metaphor, but that's an instance of the way in which one can have at least to oneself, exciting little thoughts about it.
I have an answer, a kind of an answer. Maybe you won't like it, but in one central, it's not the only one. It's a bad idea to talk about Christianity or Judaism or whatever if you're not clear about what version you're talking about. But there's a strong line in Judaism that says we know nothing and can know nothing about God. Nothing. This line is so strong that in order to resist any temptation to believe that we could know anything about God, we insist that we can't even know the name, right? However, God has required us to talk about Him. And therefore, it's really hard to cleave to this. But it fascinates me. In my synagogue, I got into the habit years ago because I like to watch the musicians of sitting in the balcony so that I can see them. And I began to fixate. It's been driving me crazy. I'm going to give a lecture about it in my synagogue this year. There's a stained glass window on the opposite wall depicting Moses. And of course, the second commandment says we shouldn't make such a thing. Right. And what's worse than that is the commandments, obviously written in Hebrew, are prefixed by Roman numerals. The whole thing is you must have bought it from some supply house. The commandment says don't make pictures. It doesn't say what kids get taught. Don't make pictures of God. It says don't make pictures. Don't make any pictures. Now, why those people didn't want pictures, I don't know. I've thought about it a lot. But I do know that, and of course, Catholicism buys into this. It's just that with regard to graven images, they got into that business so early they can't get out of it. But if you want to see an Abrahamic religion that doesn't make pictures, go to a mosque. Yeah. Of course, if you go to a 14th century mosque, you'll see pictures. They haven't always cleaved so closely.
They have pictures of letters, though.
Right. But now the question is, if you get there, if you're in your synagogue, or in my synagogue, on, say, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, I have to say things about God. And my preference is a medieval French poem that is one metaphor after another. I'm a vineyard, God is the keeper. I'm a lamb, God is the shepherd. And it goes on like this. So what's this all about? I think that we shouldn't resist the denigration of some metaphors historically as simply being a kind of a flowery showing off. They're not all metaphors are rich and valuable and deep and important. Sometimes they're trivial. I get them out of my students when I say make up a metaphor. But what is the situation in which two things are true? You have to speak, and you can't say anything literal. Now, the reasons why you can't say anything literal might be varied. In the religious case I'm talking about, it's because there are no literal truths. So that's the reason. But you have to speak. And now, this is one of the reasons why I think metaphors have got something important in common with jokes. They're what we do when we can't do what it seems like we would like to do for one reason or another. You can't overthrow the goddamn government, but you can make fun of it. You can't defy political correctness, but you can prick it a little here and there. You cannot say a truth about God, but you can say, He's my king. He's my friend. Now, taken literally, these are all false. And if you believed any of them literally, you would be guilty of one heresy or another. So you have to keep in mind that this is figuration. The Catholic Church has a long history of worrying about, anagogical this and so on and so forth. But it comes from this old idea. The idea that when you know the name of a thing, I'm out of my depth here. I mean, this is a psychoanalytic, is it right? When you know the name of a thing, you have power over it. This is, of course, what the Rumpelstiltskin story is about.
The first commandment, too.
Well,
God, to name the world. Yeah.
The first commandment is, I am the Lord thy God.
No, I mean in the Garden of Eden.
Oh, yes, right. But children, I think, get this idea. Children get this idea pretty quickly, and it's a kind of. If you think about that story, notice how easily children absorb it. The little girl nothing happens that gives her power over this kind of evil guy, but when she learns his name, now, it's the idea that knowledge is a kind of power, and therefore you can't know about God because it would tempt you to think that you had. Freud knows all this stuff. Freud, for all the stuff he writes about Judaism that I don't like, at least sort of knows what he's talking about there, unlike Christopher Hitchens. But the one other thing I'd like to mention is just this. When I first was at these sessions, actually I was there. The Davidson paper was given at that session.
Yes, I know.
Together. And Gardner presented this stuff, and he reported this that made no impression on me at the time, that before the age of 4 or 5 or whatever, not only do children not make metaphors, but they seem to be kind of upset by them. And I don't know that that's true, but if it is, my son, Amos, had a genius kindergarten teacher, a woman named Vivian Paley. You should read Vivian's books. The one MacArthur Fellowship that did some good went to her. She told me this. I embroider only slightly. Kids very early get the idea that the world is dangerous, that they can't rely on much of anything, certainly not their parents, and that what's keeping them safe is a certain structure that's in place. Hence, if you had 2 little kids in Vivian, she's retired now, if you had 2 little kids in Vivian's kindergarten, and one of them, say, Susie, wandered off the rug, and Boris came running up to the teacher and said, Susie's off the rug, Susie's off the rug. You think that what you've got in Boris is a stool pigeon in the making. Vivian says that's not true. Boris is worried. He thinks that it's having these rules in place that's making the world livable for him. Well, now, if that's right, and I'm right in thinking making metaphor invariably involves breaking rules, then it should be no surprise that at an age in which children have become quite reliant on the idea that there is an imposed structure that's making things work, that they would not like to have rules broken even in making metaphor. But then, when they start, you know the kind of jokes that kids like best, little kids, are plays on words. And if that's not taking the language and forcing it to dance to your tune, did you ever think what a kid has to learn English? It's just astounding. And they make mistakes, and they're always being corrected. Children are abused and tyrannized in many ways. And when they finally get a joke they like, where does the king keep his armies? Up his sleeves. They love this. Damn right. I can make these words do tricks. They can't force me. The idea that there's freedom in making metaphors and jokes, I think, is terribly important. And that's, of course, why when you've got a metaphor, you've got a small-scale, crystalline work of art. It's a piece of creation that comes from the human spirit to make something new. He mentioned Kant earlier. Kant says, or she did, Kant says it takes genius to do this. But the genius is not enough, because you could just produce what he calls original nonsense. You then need to stand back and exercise taste to see whether what you produce is any good. That's why I think we have to have metaphor, because we have to live. We have to experience human freedom, and that's one way in which we do it. It's why I love the people who make it, and if I ever produce a good one, I pat myself on the back all day long, but that's a rare occurrence.
I'd like to, at Rosanna's apt suggestion, conclude by reading the whole of the poem that I read part of earlier. You like it under the trees in autumn, because everything is half dead. The wind moves like a cripple among the leaves and repeats words without meaning. In the same way, You were happy in spring with the half colors of quarter things, the slightly brighter sky, the melting clouds, the single bird, the obscure moon. The obscure moon lighting an obscure world of things that never would be quite expressed, where you yourself were never quite yourself, and did not want nor have to be, desiring the exhilarations of changes, the motive for metaphor, shrinking from the weight of primary noon, the ABC of being, the ruddy temper, the hammer of red and blue, the hard sound, steel against intimation, the sharp flash, the vital, arrogant, fatal, dominant X.
Further information about our programs and a complete archive of past Philoctetes events is available at philoctetes.org.